I want to revisit a theory put out there by Pierre LeBrun, which reported the fact that maybe Jesper Bratt isn't demanding for more money, but less years. And that kind of makes sense considering the fact that the Devils have $34 million in cap space and Bratt still hasn't budged. But am I willing to re-sign Jesper Bratt to a shorter deal? And also, what are the betting lines saying for the New Jersey Devils and their potential to win a Stanley Cup come next season? We have a lot to talk about in today's episode. Locked On Devils. Buckle up, everybody.
You're Locked On Devils, your daily podcast on the New Jersey Devils. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, this is Bryce Salvador, and you're Locked On Devils with Trey Matthews.
Scores! Oh, Stevens stepped up, nailed it. Brodor's got the puck. What a shot. The Devils win the Stanley Cup.
Alrighty now, what is up, New Jersey? Welcome back to the Locked On Devils podcast here on Locked On Network. I'm your host, college hockey play-by-play announcer, Devils Wire for Pucks and Pitchforks, and also part-time credential MIA member, Trey Matthews. A champion has been crowned, and the 2022-2023 NHL season has officially come to a close. Congratulations to the Vegas Golden Knights. They have not been in the league all that long, as you guys know, just a few years in the league, and they already have a Stanley Cup title added to their resume. So a banner is going to be hung at T-Mobile Arena. So once again, congratulations to the Vegas Golden Knights. And even though the NHL season is now officially over, we're officially in the offseason for all 32 teams. Vegas is like New York City. It is the city that never sleeps on the West Coast because they've already put out their betting odds in regard to teams that could potentially win the Stanley Cup come next year. And according to FanDuel, the New Jersey Devils have the fourth best odds. We're going to talk about that in the second segment, but to begin this show, I have another, how would I say it? It's not exactly an update, but I have a series of thoughts in regard to Jesper Bratt and his contract situation. Once more, I know you guys are tired of me talking about it. Trust me, I'm tired of just finding new ways to complain or share it with you guys. But nonetheless, I got to put it out there. And then in the third and final segment, I'm going to talk about some key centerpieces that can help the Devils potentially reach the Stanley Cup Final next season. So once again, let's start with Jesper Bratt and his contract situation. So a couple days ago, I did an episode revolved around Timo Meier and Jesper Bratt and their contract updates. And one of the sources that I used was Ryan Novozinsky. So a few days ago, Ryan Novozinsky actually released an article. He spoke with Jesper Bratt's agent, and he was able to get some insight. And towards the end of the article, Novo said that Pierre LeBrun is theorizing that it might not be a money issue with Bratt, but it might be a length issue, as in the Devils might be trying to link up Jesper Bratt long-term, but Bratt and his camp want a short-term deal. Now, why do they want that? Well, to jog your memory, according to Commissioner Gary Bettman, the salary cap is projected to go up $1 million during the course of the offseason, and it's only going to continue to rise from here on out. So Jesper Bratt is probably looking for an opportunity to sign a short-term deal, so that way when he becomes an unrestricted free agent, he's still relatively young. He could get a lucrative deal because, let's face it, if he is with the Devils long-term, he's not going to be top priority, and he wants to test the waters just a little bit more, similar to what Damon Severson's situation is, which we'll touch on momentarily. So basically, that's what Pierre LeBrun is theorizing, that Jesper Bratt might want a shorter deal, so that way he could test the open waters, get a lucrative contract, and I guess run off into the sunset, if you would. Now, I have some thoughts in regard to that. So someone hit me up on Twitter and asked me, like, what's it going to be like if Jesper Bratt potentially gets paid more than Hughes? Because quite honestly, that might be an option for Jesper Bratt's camp as well, because obviously the Devils were able to extend Nico Hischier and Jack Hughes before both of them were able to have career years. But for Jesper Bratt, he was able to have a career year this year and also last year because he matched his end of the year point totals. And the asking price for Bratt is a little different compared to Hughes and Hischier because when they were extended, they were at different points of their already young and promising career. think of like Cole Caulfield when he just signed his extension with the Montreal Canadiens. Obviously, he has not set the league on fire yet, but you know that potential is there for Caulfield when the opportunity will present itself and when circumstances go into his favor, because obviously he had to deal with a coaching change that actually helped him out. St. Louis was able to get the most out of him. And then just this past year, Caulfield got injured and he missed some significant time. So it's a similar situation to Jack Hughes, but digressing a little bit, when responding to that tweet in regard to Bratt potentially getting paid more than Hughes, I responded and said, no clue what Jesper Bratt is demanding, but Pierre LeBrun, obviously, like I said, is theorizing that it might be a short-term deal because Bratt wants to test the open market. And Pucks and Pitchforks, which is the site that I write at, they also quote tweeted my initial response, and they said that the annual asking price is not what's going to push the Devils to trade Bratt. It's the demand for a shorter deal. Not saying he's wrong since the cap is expected to go up soon, but anything less than 5 years after 4 years of negotiations is likely a no-go for Tom Fitzgerald. And basically a lot of people were sharing their responses like, do you want Jesper Bratt linked up for a long period of time? Do you want him signed to a short-term deal? And one of the responses that someone put out said that if Bratt wants something similar to Severson, then why not he take it? Because it would be 8 years, $6.25 million. He can have that all day, every day. And I said, well, here's the thing. Severson did get a pay increase, and there was no way the Devils were going to pay him that amount of money because his original contract with the Devils was worth $25 million total. And now his new contract with the Columbus Blue Jackets, it's worth $50 million. If you combine all 8 years, he has a full no trade clause for the first 4 seasons. And he also has some signing bonuses that can go his way that could be worth up to $10.5 million. So for Severson's contract, obviously, if that was Jesper Bratt signing it with the Devils, I think fans would be okay with that. But Severson is just a little bit different because Bratt's value is a little higher compared to Severson. Now, my overall thing is like, what do I want to do with Jesper Bratt in this case? Because I find Pierre LeBrun's theory quite compelling, but at the same time, I was hearing reports saying that the Devils did extend an offer to Bratt, and some people were saying like it could be like an 8-year deal. And I was like, okay, I would have to see what the annual price is because he could go from underrated to overrated with a snap of the finger. So my thing for Jesper Bratt is that I'm open to signing him to a shorter deal compared to Hischier and Hughes, because for what it's worth, Jesper Bratt is 24 years of age and he'll be turning 25 this July, late July to be exact. And last season, like I said, he put up 32 goals, 41 assists for a grand total of 73 points. The year prior, he put up 26 goals, 47 assists for a grand total of 73 points. So if Jesper Bratt were to sign a hypothetical deal anywhere from 4 to 5 years, quite honestly, I'd be okay with that because the one thing I want to get from Bratt is that I want to get the best years out of him. And I don't know what his mileage is going to be. I'm not a psychic. I'm not a fortune teller. But I can safely assume that it's not going to be the same compared to Hischier or Hughes. And the thing is, the Devils aren't really all that far off for competing for a Stanley Cup title. So you just need Jesper Bratt signed just long enough. That's what I have to say. So if he doesn't sign an 8-year deal, quite honestly, no harm, no foul, because I think his production, and no disrespect to him, is replaceable because right behind him, you got someone like Dawson Mercer, maybe Alexander Holtz can get up there, Nolan Foote. Basically, there's a lot of other players that show a lot of promise on the offensive side of things that can replace Jesper Bratt's productivity. And then for someone like Timo Meier, I think he is a higher priority compared to Jesper Bratt. And it's something I've been talking about religiously on this show. If I had to choose one or the other, I'm going to go with Timo all day, every day, and twice on Sundays because I think Meier can bring more to the table at the end of the day. So for Bratt, I'm okay with re-signing him to a 4 or 5 year extension. And if he wants to test free agency after a short amount of time, then go nuts. But I'd say 3 years might be pushing it a little bit, but anywhere from 1 to 2 year extension, that's a no-go for Fitz because that puts too much pressure on the Devils organization. But if we're being real with ourselves, Do you think the Devils can compete for a Stanley Cup within the next 4 or 5 years? I'd honestly say they can do that way sooner. So if you have Jesper Bratt re-signed to those 4 to 5 years, then I think you're still going to get the most out of his prime because his mileage is not going to be the same compared to Hischier and Hughes. And not only that, you still got some other reliable young guns that can take Jesper Bratt's positioning if Timo Meier hasn't done so already. Because once again, offense is not the problem for the Devils. It's the other metrics towards this puzzle. So I think for Jesper Bratt, I'm okay if his contract is a little less compared to Hischier and Hughes, because at the end of the day, Hughes and Hischier, and we'll talk about this in the third segment, are obviously the centerpieces for the Devils, and Bratt is a contributor. He obviously is one of the original core pieces, but there's more value to Hischier and Hughes. And for Bratt, it's just like, I think his production is replaceable. I think you could still legitimately give yourself a chance to win the cup within the next 4 to 5 years if he is extended. But at the same time, I think Bratt needs to know that the circumstances are a little different compared to years prior, because the Devils now have options and the Devils are trying to compete for something. So they're definitely going to see that value increase, if that makes sense. So when responding to all the messages that I've been getting on Twitter asking about Bratt's contract, what I would do, there's my opinion, which is I don't care if Jesper Bratt re-signs 8 years. It would be good if he does at a cheap price, of course, if the asking price is correct. That'd be great and all. But if it's 4 to 5 years, I still think you can utilize that to the best of your ability. And it's not like it's a Hischier or Hughes situation. And both of them are the better players, and there's still some players behind Bratt that can take his place. So there's my thoughts on Jesper Bratt and the theory that he might sign a short-term deal in order to test the open market. And if he wants to do that, then I wish him the best of luck, because by the time that 4 to 5 year contract is up, he'll either be 29 or 30. So he'd still be relatively young. He wouldn't be the oldest, but he wouldn't be the youngest either. And it would sort of be like a Damon Severson situation. So we're going to move on from Jesper Bratt and his contract discussion, and we're going to talk about another aspect that could go the Devils' way come next year, because like I said, the FanDuel betting odds have already gone to work as soon as the final horn sound to signify that the Vegas Golden Knights were the Stanley Cup champions. But before we continue, as fitting that this episode is sponsored by FanDuel. So make your way to FanDuel, because right now new customers can get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. There's no better place to bet on all the playoff action. Well, playoffs are now over, but congratulations to the Vegas Golden Knights and congratulations to the Denver Nuggets. But still, nonetheless, there's still some sports happening throughout America and beyond. And it is America's #1 sports book. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Okay, so I literally told you an ad read courtesy of FanDuel. So let's look at the NHL betting odds going into next season. So like I said at the beginning of the episode, the New Jersey Devils, according to FanDuel, have the 4th best odds of winning the Stanley Cup come next season. Ahead of them are the Colorado Avalanche, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and the Edmonton Oilers. And the Devils' odds plus 1,300 is tied with the Boston Bruins, Carolina Hurricanes, Vegas Golden Knights, and also the Tampa Bay Lightning. But the experts are giving the Devils the slight advantage. Now, who's ahead of the Devils? That's quite interesting, because obviously the Avalanche have dealt with injury and they weren't able to make a deep playoff run. They got beat in 7 games by the Seattle Kraken. The Toronto Maple Leafs, for the first time since 2004, were able to make it past the first round, but then they eventually lost to the Eastern Conference champions, and that was the Florida Panthers. And the Edmonton Oilers, despite them having Leon Draisaitl and probably one of the greatest players to ever play this game, or if you ask some people, the greatest player in Connor McDavid, we never talk about them as being legitimate Stanley Cup favorites, because despite them having Draisaitl and McDavid, it's hard to build around them, because obviously they're not going to come at a cheap penny. And there's a few other players that can definitely put up some big numbers. And I know it's not just the McDavid and Draisaitl show. They still got Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Zach Hyman, a few others. So what are my thoughts on the odds of the Devils potentially winning the Stanley Cup next year? Now, the thing is a little complicated because we don't know how the roster is constructed for the time being. So obviously Damon Severson is the first one to go, and I don't think he's going to be the last one either. And when looking at the Devils for the time being, obviously they have a lot of players who are signed long-term, but there's still a lot of X-factor players that you need to consider. So when looking at the salary cap situation, obviously Jack Hughes is signed long-term, Nico Hischier is signed long-term, Andre Palat is signed long-term. But then looking at the other forwards, Dawson Mercer, this is the final year of his entry-level contract. Nathan Bastian, Jesper Boquist, Jesper Bratt, Michael McLeod, Timo Meier, Yegor Sharangovich are all restricted free agents. Then Eric Haula, Tomas Tatar, and Miles Wood are all unrestricted free agents. And then for the defensive side of things, Dougie Hamilton signed long-term. John Marino signed long-term. Jonas Siegenthaler signed long-term. Then Brendan Smith has 1 year remaining on his contract. Luke Hughes has 2 years remaining on his entry-level contract. Kevin Ball's a restricted free agent. Ryan Graves is an unrestricted free agent. And Akira Schmid has 1 year remaining on his entry-level contract. Vitek Vanecek has 2 years remaining on his respective deals. So when looking at how the roster is currently constructed, can this team potentially win the Stanley Cup come next year? I would like to say yes, but it's a little hard because I don't know who's coming back. I don't know who's going to be dealt away. I don't know what offseason moves Tom Fitzgerald is going to make. So it's kind of hard for me to make that assessment right here, right now. And I can only base everything off of what I saw last season. But it's really hard to do so because, like I said, the roster is not finished yet. It still needs a lot of work. So I wrote down some things that I would like to see the Devils do this offseason to better their chances of going to the Stanley Cup Final and potentially winning the whole thing. So the one thing that the Devils need to work on is to maintain their depth pieces. So when looking at, once again, to some players who are set to become restricted free agents, you got Nathan Bastian. You got to bring him back. Michael McLeod, you got to bring him back. Timo Meier, Jesper Bratt. In segment 1, I talked about Jesper Bratt and his whole ordeal. For Timo Meier, I think he is the more valuable asset. So if you can't get a long-term deal worked out with Bratt and his camp, work on it with Meier ASAP. I think Meier has met with the Devils organization because rumors were going around last week saying that Meier was set to meet with Tom Fitzgerald and company to get a deal done, or his camp was. And good news for you guys is that Meier was training in Devils gear from head to toe. So I don't think Meier plans on leaving the Devils organization anytime soon, if it's any consolation, but take that with a grain of salt. So that's what the Devils need to make sure that they work on, which is you got to maintain your depth pieces, because one of the reasons why the Devils were able to be so successful this season was because a lot of players up and down their lineup were like glue pieces. So these are sort of like the unsung heroes, like Nathan Bastian, Michael McLeod, Eric Haula, and a few other players who are not going to be given their roses, because obviously we talk about Jack Hughes, we talk about Nico Hischier, we talk about Dougie Hamilton, we talk about Akira Schmid, and that's great and all, but let's focus on some other players who are going to be huge assets for the team, because one of the reasons why the Devils were able to go on that 13-game win streak, because I talked about it a few episodes ago, it's that BMW line, and obviously I project that Wood is going to be forced out. I don't think the Devils are going to bring him back, and I think there's some other options to go to, including like Curtis Lazar. But when looking at just like the forwards or the defensemen, I think the defensemen, quite honestly, are okay, because 3 of the top 4 defensemen for the Devils will be returning. So Dougie Hamilton, John Marino, Jonas Siegenthaler, and unfortunately Ryan Graves. I don't think the Devils will be able to afford him unless Graves wants to sign a cheap deal. But I think the defense will be okay, especially with Luke Hughes, Kevin Ball, Shimon Nemeth in the pipeline. I think the defense will be in good hands for New Jersey. And now when looking at the goalie situation, I don't project for Mackenzie Blackwood to return, quite honestly. I talked about it a couple of weeks ago. I think Mackenzie Blackwood already has 1 foot out the door, and I don't think the opportunity for Blackwood to see more playing time is going to be here in New Jersey. So I think for the Devils, especially with Nico Dawes now out for an extended period of time, because according to Ben Burnell, Dawes recently had hip surgery, And even though he's recovering for the time being, that's still another X factor you have to take into consideration, which is who's going to be that third string goalie for the Devils, or potentially a new backup if the Devils want to go that route. I'd say, like in the previous episode, I talked about Connor Hellebuck. I said I don't think that's a good idea, considering the fact that's a big risk for a player that's going to demand for a lot of money in about a year when he hits the open market. I just don't think it would be a smart investment for the Devils to do that. But it doesn't take away from the fact that the free agency market is a little weak this year. And that includes goaltending, because obviously you got people like Jonathan Quick or Frederick Anderson and maybe Aiden Hill who are out there, but I don't see the Devils pursuing any of them, and I don't see the Devils nabbing any of them. So look for a third string goalie who can potentially be a solid backup, preferably someone who has some playoff experience, so that can rub off on Vanecek just a little bit more. And yeah, that's my offseason needs for Devils. It's a little different this year just because the Devils were able to have a successful season in which they were able to reach the second round of the playoffs. And now, instead of just like having these big red circles saying Devils really need to fix this, they really need to fix that, it's more of just doing some spring cleaning, if you would, if I can use that example, which is the Devils just have to tidy up just a little bit. Like, it's not perfect, but at the same time, their worst can still be better than most people's best. And I think a lot of teams would yearn for that. So my offseason needs for Devils, in order for them to become Stanley Cup contenders, is that they need to maintain their depth or look for some sandpaper type of players, like Tom Fitzgerald was saying during his exit interview, because you can never have too much grit or toughness on up and down your lineup. And then for goalie situation, I don't think the Devils need to go all that expensive. Personally, I have not given up in Vanecek or Schmidt. I think both of them have a lot of upside. I think you need to find a third string goalie to replace Mackenzie Blackwood, or someone who's probably capable of being that backup. So let me know what you guys think in that regard, because FanDuel once again is saying that the Devils have the fourth best odds of winning the Stanley Cup. And to give you guys some reference, if you guys were to put down a $100 wager for the Devils to win the Stanley Cup, you could potentially win $1,300. Now, I'm not saying put that wager down. I'm just giving you guys an example. Like I always say, please bet responsibly. So like I said, this offseason is a little different compared to last year, because now the Devils have their centerpieces. They have their pieces that they're going to build around for the future. And quite honestly, I know I said I'm a little skeptical about saying like how well the Devils will do next year, because it's June, guys. A lot can happen within the next couple months. We'll see how the Devils construct their roster. But the one thing I can say is that the Devils do have their centerpieces to build around. So I found this tweet interesting. If you want a real common denominator among Stanley Cup winners, look at number one centers. Jack Eichel is one of the worst number one centers to win a cup post-lockout, and he's Jack freaking Eichel. Same goes for Ryan O'Reilly. The worst number one centers to win a cup are miles above the worst number one defenseman. That's a little interesting, because the Devils have not one, but two centers that they could go to, and you could possibly make them number one centers. Obviously, you got the captain, Nico Hischier, great two-way player, finalist for the Selke Trophy. And then you got Jack Hughes, who's the franchise piece. So when looking at Jack and Nico, they are definitely going to have to be the personnel that makes this engine drive for the Devils, because I talked about it in segment one. I talked briefly about it in segment two. And obviously, that person was right to tweet that, because when you have a good number one center, then the sky is the limit for what you could potentially do with your organization. And the best part about Jack Hughes and Nico Hischier is that neither one of them have entered their primes. They're signed long-term, and they've only touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of their overall potential and development. So my expectations, my way too early expectations for Hughes and Hischier come next year is that I need Hischier to, and Hughes for that matter, to take their games to even greater heights. So for Jack Hughes, you need to get 100 plus points, and you need to be tops in the NHL for goals, assists, and points. I'm not talking about tops on the Devils roster. I'm talking about best of the best amongst the NHL, because one of the reasons why Jack Hughes was not a finalist for the Hart Memorial Trophy is because despite him being tops on the Devils roster for points, assists, goals, all that, amongst the rest of the NHL, he didn't even crack the top 5 in either category. So that's what I want Hughes to work on a little bit more. And then for Hischier, it's more of just like, I'm curious to see how much higher can Hischier take his game, quite honestly, because I want Hischier to be a little more selfish. It's the same advice I gave for Hughes, which is I'm glad that Hughes wants to get his teammates involved. And the same can be said for Hischier, because one of the reasons why Dawson Mercer or Tomas Tatar were able to have big years was because they're paired alongside someone like Nico Hischier, who's able to get the most out of them. And that's great and all. And I saw it towards the end of the year and I saw it during the playoffs, but I want Hischier to be more selfish. I want him to shoot the puck more, and I want him to get his goals up just a little bit higher, because I think Hischier can sort of be like Hughes, and this might be a hot take, but I think Hischier can eclipse 100 points similar to Hughes someday. But I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. And obviously, if the offense isn't there for Hischier, obviously the defense is. So in terms of that FanDuel odds of the Devils winning the Stanley Cup come next year, you know, obviously I don't really look at the betting odds all that much, because I always say take it with a grain of salt, because obviously it's from an optic standpoint, not a detailed standpoint, and it's based off what happened last year, and the Devils roster is not fully constructed. So, and when looking at the teams that are ahead of them, I don't know what you guys are predicting to potentially win the Stanley Cup come next year, but obviously you got the Avalanche, Leafs, and Oilers. So that's a pretty curious pick. And obviously, just like a week or two ago, the FanDuel sports betting odds were picking the Carolina Hurricanes to win the whole thing come next year. And I can understand that as well, because Andrei Svechnikov missed the entirety of the playoffs due to injury. Tara Vinen missed some time as well. And obviously the Carolina Hurricanes were able to make it to the Eastern Conference Finals, the third round. And unfortunately, they lost to the Florida Panthers. And now it's just like, what if the Hurricanes were fully healthy? What could have happened? But I'm not locked on Hurricanes. I'm not locked on Panthers, so I can't really touch on that in great detail. But the one thing I can say for the Devils is that if they're able to add more grit, if they're able to maintain their depth pieces, and if Jack Hughes and Nico Hischier are able to take their games even higher, and quite honestly, even if they don't reach I'd say 2 levels higher, I still think that they're still going to be very successful players for the Devils roster. But keeping my expectations moderate for the time being, because it is June. Season just ended for the entirety of the NHL discourse. So just putting that out there, because I found those betting lines very interesting. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. Do you think the Devils have a good chance of winning the Stanley Cup come next year? Where would you rank them? And if not, who's your pick? And also, what do you think about Jesper Bratt? How long do you want him re-signed for? Leave a comment down below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast streaming service, hit me up on my personal Twitter page at TreyMatt4 or the show's Twitter page at Locked On Devils. As for today's episode, that's all the time I have for you. So continue to stay safe. Have a wonderful day, New Jersey. Go Devils. I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Thanks for listening once again.